order for the Fire Police Disability Retirement Fund, City of Portland. It is Tuesday, May 28th, and it is 1:06. Can we have a roll call of officers, please?
Trustee Lehman?
Here.
Trustee McLeod?
Here.
Trustee Fouts?
Here.
Hunziker?
Present.
And Sam, could you kind of explain why we're missing our regular chair today?
Oh, yes. Unfortunately, there is a fine print in the charter that specifically says a board chair could not have worked for either the police bureau or the fire bureau. And Jennifer Cooperman back in 2010 and 11 had worked for the fire bureau, which disqualified her as being board chair or the mayor's designee who was serving as the board chair. It's just something that everybody overlooked at the time. She was nominated, and she's the one that found the wording and brought it up, and city attorney's office read it and reread it, tried to see if there was any way that she could stay, but it's pretty clear that she couldn't. So unfortunately, the position's vacant. The mayor's office is now looking for a designee for the mayor because the mayor will not be serving as board chair. And we hope by the next board meeting, we will have that person here.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Next item is approval of minutes from the March 19th, 2019 meeting. Do we have any discussion or additions, subtractions from the board?
None here. No.
Hearing none, I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes from March 19th.
I'll move to approve the minutes.
We have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. I'd like to start out with the introduction of visitors. So everybody out there in the audience, if we could, so we have an idea of who's here today, if we could start over here in the back on the left. I think that's Lauren.
Lauren Downhart, outside legal counsel. Josh Howard of the City Budget Office.
Kristen Johnson, Commissioner Hardison's office.
Stacy Jones, Fpdr Finance Manager.
Joe Chipinowski, retired fire.
Henry Gripper, retired Port Police Bureau.
Hal Freoff, President, Retired Police Officers Association.
Del Stevens, President, retired firefighter association.
Anil Kari, lawyer for Port Police Association.
And Captain Blake for the FFA Local 43. David Short, retired Portland Fire.
Crystal Lopez Liaison.
Frank O'Connell, Fire Liaison.
Mitchell, Fpdr.
Frank Ovich, in City Attorney's Office.
Mark Amber, City Attorney's Office.
Kathy Kakisaka, FPDR.
Sam Hutchison, FPDR.
Welcome, everyone. And I heard there might be a problem with the microphones or something, so if you can't hear us, let us know. Maybe we'll have you move forward, we'll get it fixed. So, next thing is a public comment period. There's a sign-up sheet over here. We do have some members. Can we call them off in order? And we do have a 3-minute time period we'll try to adhere to. And I think there's going to be a timer up here, and so you'll know how much time you have. So,
Joe Jimkowski,
Joe Jimkowski.
and then Del Stevens.
Was Dell the second? Kevin?
Let me know when time starts.
Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, thank you.
And I'll start by saying Joe's spoke to us before. There's some background with Joe, who's explained it to the board before. So I told him to try to keep it concise so we can get it into the 3 minutes. If anybody else has any questions of Joe, I think he'd be happy to explain it to you outside of this process also. Is that correct, Joe?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. First off, I want to thank you for the opportunity to come back and speak to you again. It's been a rather difficult process to get here through phone calls and through email denials, but under the 3-minute rule here, I'm allowed to come here and speak to you. So I'm thankful for that 3-minute rule, and I got the clock there. I want to apologize for missing the January meeting. I wanted to come back and answer your questions that Trustee McLeod answered and Trustee Hutzinger answered at the November meeting, because I had a lot of details there and gave you handouts. But I apologize. I had a tooth infection that spread up to my eye and was having trouble seeing, and I couldn't speak, so I missed the meeting. I tried to come back in the March meeting, and I had some digestive problems that morning. I was running a few minutes late, called Fpdr. I said, if you're late, you probably can't speak. So based on that, I didn't want to take a risk of coming here, not being able to speak. So I said, I apologize again. Can I please be on the May meeting? I was told, no, that's fine. So now I'm here today to officially ask, again, I'm asking to be on the July Fpdr board meeting to respond to the November questions that were asked to me at the November Fpdr board meeting. Those questions were never answered, and if the board wants to answer those questions, I will gladly come back and take about 10 minutes to answer those 2 questions. I have some handouts for you that explain your questions that you asked in detail. You have all the answers to those questions. So I'm asking, and I don't know if you could respond right now with an answer, or is that something the board has to think about? If I can come back and be on the agenda for the July meeting to answer those questions.
Okay, yeah, I think we can decide right now if we would like to do that.
Yeah, I welcome anybody to the agenda, so absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd make a motion to allow Joe to come back to the agenda, but maybe there's a possibility this is a 3-minute, and then we can open up to discussion, other questions that we might have, but I'd make a motion to allow him to come to an agenda, or put him on the agenda.
Do we have a motion? Do we have a second?
I agree, I second that.
Thank
Okay.
you.
We have
Thank
a
you.
motion and a second. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Thank you
Motion
for
carries.
allowing me to use my First Amendment right. I appreciate that, because I
Okay.
was concerned about that. So I'm not going to go in detail on that right now, because I'd rather come back and do the, some handouts for you at the July meeting on the agenda, and give the handouts, say about, should only take about 10 minutes, 15 minutes maybe, to give you all the details, so you understand fully what I explained at that November meeting. You have a full picture of what's going on. And I appreciate that, because it's important to me to know that you're willing to listen to that. And I will be here in July, by the way, even if, no matter what, no matter how I feel, no matter what's going on, I will be here on time. I will be here, even if they have to drag me on a gurney, but I will be here at that July meeting no matter what. 100% guaranteed I will be here at that meeting.
So,
No matter-
Joe, let me add one thing, and not to take away from your time, we'll keep track of that. We don't have anything on the agenda for the July meeting right now, other than possibly this. So if we don't have anything else, would it be a problem to address this in September, or would that be too late for your?
No. I picked July because I think June, it says at the board's discretion, so I assumed it was, I made the assumption, no June meeting. Then July was the
Yeah.
next one where it said you had a possible meeting. So.
Well, the last I heard, we didn't have anything yet, so we can discuss that, but.
I think there's a huge, that's not a timer, by the way. That's just a lot of construction, which is great timing, by the way. That's fantastic. Just to be clear, and if I remember, history repeats itself, July's kind of the vacation month. It's hard to get schedules
Sure,
together
sure.
in July. So I believe there's been a tradition that we sometimes forego the July meeting. So I think September would work.
That's fine.
I don't want to take away from your time. Did you have anything else that you wanted to put forward? Because I have some questions for you, but I wanted you to finish anything.
No,
that you
I mean,
had.
the main thing is, I came forward back in November with an olive branch, okay? I didn't come with any kind of adversary approach. I came through with the research that I found, over 5+ years of research that I found. I wanted to present this back to the board, because, especially with new board members, and especially with the police officer and firefighter, because everything I'm saying here affects you two, it affects everyone that came before me, it affects everyone that came after me. And the sad truth is that the ones telling us we can't have this benefit actually have the benefit. You know, they get a police and fire pension. This one quick thing, this year PERS is expanding the police and fire definition, classification, which I spoke about. Now the dog catcher gets it. No disrespect to the dog catcher, but now the dog catcher will get a police and fire pension under PERS. Kudos for the dog catcher, but what about Portland police officers and firefighters? I said, what about our members? Why don't they get these benefits that the law requires? And that's all I've been saying, that's all I've been asking for, what the law requires. You know, I took an oath years ago to follow the law, and I followed that law truly. I'd even touch patients some guys were afraid to touch, but I worked on them, and to this day, I follow that oath. And following that oath is, all I'm asking for to the board to hear is what the law says we're entitled to have. And I don't believe the board heard the full story, and that's why I'm bringing it forward to the board. And I really appreciate you willing to listen, because not everybody listens, and you're willing to listen, and that's how we solve problems. You come together, we solve, and there's a solution here. There's a win-win for everybody to walk away with minimal impact on everybody, and I believe there's a solution here with the retired associations, probably with the unions. There's probably a workable solution here. We walk away, we comply with
Let
the
me
law.
interject right there, Joe, because I
Okay, I'm
think
done.
we're going down kind of a similar path
Sure.
where we had trouble before, and I want to make sure that we stay clear on this. If I understand your request from before, it was to have a test under the format that you would describe that is different than the format that has been in the past. Am I correct so far?
Well, no, what was done before raises a question. I believe the question was raised in
Hold on,
January.
the full question is, you want a different form of a test other than the test that was done before. Your thought process is that if a different process or a different test was done, it would be, more clarification would come out. Am I correct in that?
No, let me back up. The test that was done was maybe done correctly, but the facts were not correct.
Okay.
That's the problem. The testing process is fine. It's the facts that presented in there are not valid.
So if we had the same tests,
With the
if
valid
the
facts.
same tests were done, and the facts that you're speaking of were added and/or subtracted into the same exact test under a preliminary audit or whatever we want to do, that would satisfy your question, right? I'm not saying it would give you the results you want. What I'm saying is, if as listening to you talk in all these meetings, you're looking for a question to be asked, and you would accept the answer to that question. Is that correct?
What I'm looking for is that there's 4 aspects in the law that the test is supposed to measure right now. It changed over the years. The most current one, under 459-030-0025, says you have to have a disability retirement with post-medical benefits.
Wait. Hold on 1 second. I'm not asking about the actual question. Your desire for response.
It's to comply with the law. that's
Right.
all.
What you're looking for is
Compliance with the law.
to have a request done under, and we can look at what your request would be. You would be happy, it would suffice the response that you get from the tests that we ask for, if we ask for a test and under that fashion, right? The reason I say that is, if we move forward and apply the test that you're asking, right? The answer is what it is.
Correct.
I think we've done our response, if we do it, would have done our responsibility, and you would be accepting of the answer that comes back from that test.
If the test comply with the law, sure, as long as it comply with the law. And I'm not saying, I'm not going to downplay, but I think in the January meeting, a question was asked, how do you get 80% of a value when there's no value there? Because I went back and watched, I missed the January meeting, and I heard that question asked to the gentleman who was sitting here, Mr. Larrabee, and who's a key player in this. The question was asked, how do you get 80% of a benefit when there's no benefit there?
So this is what I would ask of you, and I know you've provided a lot of information. I asked for this before, and you might have provided some of the information, and I'm not trying to speak for the other trustees. What I would like to see is a very succinct request on what you're asking the board to evaluate and test against. That way, we can ask the history what that test was, and we can decide whether we want to invest the money and/or move forward. It's a responsibility to move forward, or it's a responsibility that that question has been answered. Because I think that's what we're weighing here is, that question's already been asked, we've got the answer, but you're saying it has never been asked correctly.
Well, and what I wanted to share with you, and that's why I asked for.
So, Joe, we're way over
Okay,
the
all
3
right, I'm
minutes.
sorry.
So I think,
Yes.
unless there's more, did you get the answers you want?
I will
You
bring
understand what
now.
I'm asking for? That you could provide to the trustees prior to, I'm guessing, July and/or September.
Right, I'll provide you with the way the test is supposed to be, the process with the law.
Very clear, very succinct, and I want to keep it as tight as we can. 'Cause
It'll-
a binder of 150
Be less than
pages
that, be
is.
less than that.
Right, very clear, because we've gotten other information about prior tests, and we want to make sure that we're weighing them correctly. I think that's our responsibility, is to at least listen to your concerns, understand your concerns fully, and then you understanding our position on it as well.
Okay, I will bring you forward with the test involves, with the 4 things to look at, how the test is supposed to be administered. I also will bring you, in addition, I have a response from PERS, their response to all this whole big question. I have their official answers on paper, what they say is happening, and none of it matches. And that's the concern I have, is that it doesn't
Okay,
match.
we'll take a
But
look
I will
at
bring
it
it all
that
back
time.
to you and let you make a decision after that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Did anybody else have any more questions?
Nope.
Okay. Can I ask
Thank
you,
you,
I
thank
have
you,
one more.
thank you very much for coming, let me come back.
Yeah, Joe, how long do you think you would need to,
10, 15 minutes?
okay, Kathy, can you put him on for 15 minutes for the next regular board meeting that we have, which will either be July or September?
Yeah, facts are facts, they're quick.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Dell Stevens.
Well, the reason I'm here today is just to express the fact that we have a lot of retired firefighters and police who have the same concerns that Mr. Jimkowski does about our disability, about our benefits, about our comparison to the PERS benefits. And I think that it's appropriate occasionally review those and look back and see if the tests that have been done in the past were done correctly, and if the standards that were used were properly done. And there's nothing wrong with making sure that we're in conformity with the law, because the law is what is supposed to regulate everything we're doing. And we have our own pension board rules, we have PERS, ORS statutes, and we have federal laws about discrimination, about disability. And there's several areas there that need to be explored and reviewed. And I think more than a 15-minute review of it would be the result if you start looking at it, because there were things done in the past that were not fully vetted. And just to give you a quick example, in 1990, our pension was reformed, and I worked on that process for 2 years. And when we did reform it, the intention was to make it as good or better than PERS, equal to or better than where that was a standard, okay? At the time we went through that process, I didn't feel we met the standard, and I was the only one, after a year of work on it, that said, I will vote for it reluctantly because I don't feel we've met the standard. And wouldn't you know it, after it was passed by the members of the fire and police and by the voters, and towards the fall of 1990, it turned out that the new pension did not meet the standard. It did not pass, okay? And what was done at that time, for those that may not know it, an exemption was given so that Portland did not have to conform to the law if they gave future benefits that PERS would give in conformity to meet the law. And since then, PERS has made several changes, and we have not responded in kind and added the same benefits. So I'm just expressing today that this is a matter of concern to all of us, the retired people, the active people, and it isn't just one person speaking on this. Mr. Jimkowski done a lot of research, and he's very resourceful, and he's compiled a lot of information. And so please give it the attention that it deserves, okay? Thank you.
Absolutely.
I
Thanks,
have a
Dale.
question. I have a question.
Go ahead.
And I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. We'd have to follow the guidelines for public meeting. But this is a topic that continues to come up, and I think even though, and you're doing your job because you're the representative for the retired firefighters. I think if we could follow the guidelines of a public meeting, would you be willing to come in some form of a work session where we can coordinate a schedule with and focus solely on this matter to get the questions aligned correctly so that you meet your desires, your questions, and in that work group we could have you and maybe Joe as a representative to get questions asked, legal advice in the room in a work session, some type of work session where we could work solely just on this specific topic.
I think that's an excellent idea.
Is that something you'd be willing to do if we could make sure we meet all the guidelines?
I would be willing to, and I think you should include the Retired Police Association also in that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to make sure that anyone that has concerns on this topic,
Yeah.
we're sitting around in a room, open, and I know it has to be taped and recorded and all that stuff, so we make sure all the guidelines are met, and we only focus on one topic. And that's, the biggest topic I want to get over is, what are we looking for? And time doesn't cost any money. Before we get into the money side of it, investing funds into research and things of that effect, we should get ourselves in a line here and just cost ourselves a little bit of time and energy as compared to investing money into something that we're not clear on yet. Does that make sense?
It
Would you
makes
be
very
willing to?
good sense, and I think it's appropriate to make sure that we're doing it right now. I mean, we don't want to continue the errors of the past if mistakes were made.
And I'm not acknowledging there are, I'm just saying that that would be something
Right.
we could come with together.
Good, yes. Yeah, you let me know, I'll make myself available.
There you go. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. That sounds like that's all the public comment. We're going to move to an action item, which would be resolution number 524, tax anticipation notes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
All right.
So, Stacy Jones, Fpdr Finance Manager, and what you have before you with this resolution is the same thing that you have before you every May, which is a resolution to authorize us to issue tax anticipation notes, or TANs, which are short-term municipal bonds backed by anticipated property tax receipts. As you guys know, 98% of our spending is funded with property tax revenue, but most property tax revenue comes in the middle of November, and our fiscal year starts on July 1, so we need cash to take us from July 1 to mid-November. So every year, we ask the board to authorize the TAN issuance. City Council also has to authorize the bonds. And we ask you to authorize the full budgeted amount, which this year is $52.9 million, but, because we just want to be conservative, but we rarely need that full amount. And in fact, this year, just looking at our numbers this morning, right now, I think we're only going to need about $28 million, which is even less than we issued last year. Last year, we issued for $36 million. And you may recall back in January when we were talking about the budget that we expect to have a much bigger beginning fund balance on July 1 this year than we had last year. If you remember that prior year big property tax payment from Comcast as a result of their legal settlement, and we've had some underspending in the pension budget. So we're just sitting on some more cash this year than we were last year. So we won't have to go out for quite as much as we have in the past. But we'll finalize the actual amount over the next month or so, so we'll go ahead and do what we usually do and ask you to authorize the full amount. We will only go out for what we need to. We do a highly detailed cash flow analysis, kind of every penny in, every penny out, and try to guess which dates it's going to flow in and out between now and mid-November to kind of do that final sizing. We may issue in August this year. We have enough cash that I think we can make it through July. So we may issue in August. We might issue in July. We'll try to work the timing with debt management to get the optimum interest rate. And we'll do our presentation to Moody's to get a rating on the issue in June, probably. Historically, we've gotten the highest rating, the MIG one. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't get that again this year. In the past, we have talked about the interest rate spread. So we have always made a little bit of money on our TANs, and that's because we pay less in interest on the TANs than we can earn on the proceeds in the city treasury pool. And we're always kind of wanting to make sure we maintain that positive spread so we can cover our debt issuance costs and hopefully make a little bit of money within the IRS arbitrage rebate limits. So as it stands this year for fiscal year 18-19, we're to the good about 50 basis points, about 0.5%. So we're earning a little over 2% in the city treasury pool, and we're paying 1.6% on our TANs. Next year's, the projected rates are pretty close. So, but I say this every year. Every year I think, are we still going to have a positive spread? I don't know. We'll keep an eye on it. It keeps turning out to be positive by just that little bit. But we made about $180,000 on the spread this year. And then we had to pay debt issuance costs that brought us down to about $150,000. Are there any questions?
No.
So the question was posed to me by a retired member, and I think you've answered this before. So is there a way that we could, increase the levy 1 year so we had our own balance and we just always carried a balance, that we could not have to do this? So it was all happened within the fund. Does the charter allow that to happen? Would that be something that
So
we could
there's-
do? And
Yeah.
I understand this positive balance. I mean, if we're actually making money, why
Why
wouldn't we
would
do that?
we,
But
right.
do we always make money? Is the 30-year, 40-year look, is it a positive?
So the first part of your question is legal, and I don't know the answer to the legal question. We have never pursued the legal question because the answer to the second question is so clear that we should continue to do this because there's a financial benefit. There has always been a positive interest rate spread since I've been associated with FPDR, but I haven't looked back, really far. Now, we always want to keep an eye on it. Could it flip on us at some point? Yes. It's my opinion that it's unlikely it would flip for more than a year or two. It would be in particular interest rate environment that would happen. But I think structurally, as long as we maintain our creditworthiness, we're always going to pay less on our TANs. Maybe not always, maybe not every single year, but overall, on average, we're going to wind up paying less on our tax anticipation notes than we're going to earn in the city treasury pool. So the second part of the question, which is why would we do that? It would be less financially advantageous to build up the fund balance. But then there's the legal question of, does the charter allow that, since the charter specifically says that we can only raise the funds we need. We have to, it's very specific about how we have to set the budget. So it would be a legal question. And I think the legal question would be worth pursuing if issuing TANs became financially disadvantageous. But since it has not been in my time here, we have not bothered to look into it.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question? Okay.
It'd probably be a question we'd want answered before we run into the negative.
Well, I think that when we ran into the negative, it would be during the fiscal year, and we'd have months and months to kind of think about it, and explore it before we came back. And at that point, I'd be coming back to the board and saying, all right, well, we lost this year, and the spread was negative, and this is how much money we lost. We wouldn't know that until we were in it anyway. I mean, I can tell you the interest rate we're paying on the TANs as soon as we issue, but the interest rate we're going to earn on the city treasury pool, I won't know that until the end of the next fiscal year for the overall year. But I'll be able to see where it's going and how things are looking, kind of like I can tell right now, we're going to be to the good this year. So I think we'd have adequate time to look into it if it ever came up.
Okay, does anyone have any questions on?
I have a question, Stacy. On the draft resolution, the amount not to exceed is 52 million.
Right.
So how do we come up with that number?
So that number is 4.5 months of expenses less beginning fund balance, and it's done when we budget in January. So there's a timing difference and a methodology difference. So that's the budget number, and it's just sort of historic practice to ask the board to authorize that amount. But when we get down to the nitty-gritty and do an actual cash flow analysis several months later, it's typically less. And this year it's significantly less because of the way that the fund balance is going to fall. But we will only issue for what we need. We'll ask city council to authorize the same amount, the 52.9. And we do need to be careful that we stay within the IRS arbitrage rebate limits, because that's the other question is, well, why not issue for as much as humanly possible and make even more money? We can only make so much money and not get in trouble with the IRS.
Should we, not make any changes now, but in the future, add some words in there that says not to exceed 52.9, but will only be the amount
That we
needed when we've come up with the formula or whatever? I mean, it probably should be, because that would kind of hold you to some type of standard. Not that I think you would do something outside of a standard, but.
Yeah, we can definitely add wording like that to the resolution for next year. Would be no problem.
All right. Any more questions?
Just for clarification, the IRS issue is that like unrelated business income tax or something? Or-
I'm sorry, what?
When you're referring to the arbitrage, if you were to ask for more and just hold more funds and be trying to get this difference in the money, is that IRS issue unrelated business income tax, or what is the?
So we have to get the exceptions. Let me remember the exact rule. So we use the working capital definition, which means that we can't sit on our low point in our cash balance has to be 5% or less of our prior year operating expenses, because we have to qualify for an exception, essentially. And so the exception rules are you have to be using the money for local government purposes, for governmental purposes, and then you can either go the working capital route or, I forget the other qualification standard, but we qualify under the working capital.
Okay.
So we can't have, if we have more than, I don't know exactly how much we're going to spend this year, but my ballpark I would say 5% of current year expenditures will be $7.5 million. So if we have more than $7.5 million at our very lowest moment, if we hadn't gone out for the TANs, then we're in trouble with the IRS.
Okay.
And I'm actually not sure exactly what the penalty is. We've always been
You don't wanna go there.
excessively careful to not hit it, and debt management is always very careful, taking a second look at our numbers to make sure we don't hit it. But I actually don't know what the penalty would be. Let's not find out. Actually, I will find out, but then let's not have it happen.
Any more questions? Hearing none.
Have some public comment?
Okay.
Thank you again. I just have one quick question on the bonds. I like to read, and I read a lot, and I'm reading about Fpdr bonds, and I came across some bonds that were issued. There was a 5-year bond issued by Fpdr for PERS members' post-medical benefits, and I just found a title about that, and I was just curious if someone either on the board or administration can answer that question about the Fpdr bonds being floated for additional benefits for the PERS members' post-medical benefits.
Anybody know about that? Can you reference where you saw that?
Through Moody's. Through Moody's, I found some bonds and talked about a 5-year bond, and I can supply a document, it's on my computer at home, but it talked about a 5-year bond that was floated and specified for PERS members. There's Fpdr bond floated, and it said for PERS members, post-medical benefits. And it was a 5-year bond to cover their post-medical benefits.
What year was that dated?
I don't remember the exact year, but I can get the document too. I have it at home on my computer. I could email you the document, but I was just curious about that because you never hear it mentioned. You don't hear it mentioned at all, but on Moody's it was listed as that. And I was just curious about those bonds being floated for these PERS members' post-medical benefits, which is one of the issues that we're talking
Yeah.
about.
No, if nobody knows what he's talking about, then if you could
I'll get it.
either send it to them or bring it up at the next meeting you're at, and you could look into that.
Send it to us so we have time to research. So we
Sure,
can talk
sure.
about it next time.
Okay, great.
Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Mr. Friel?
Mr. Frioff?
I think you already asked my question.
I think I did. I didn't see you on the public comment period, so.
So I got the answer. It was a question on why, go ahead and sit down. Why they don't get the money in November when they get the taxes. Because I know that they're not using I forgot what the word is, the amount that they can take of the taxes. They're not using the max. So maybe 1 year they could use the max and then either put it in a I don't know if it's supposed to go into the city treasury to pay the board, or if they could put it into a bond or a money market or some holding facility to make interest, as they do. And then that way, they could operate the full year budget, because they generally make a full year budget anyway. And that way, they wouldn't have to come ask for the TANs, which would take up less of your time, less the city's time, less paperwork, and be, much better. Or run the fiscal year November to November instead of January to, or July to July. Make the budget in commensurate with the income portion of it.
Yeah.
So, and that was it.
Yeah, so I think Stacy answered most of that. Did any of our legal counsel have any, is there a legal problem with us trying to levy amount above what we need for the year?
I don't know about legal, but I think that I get a ton of questions that pop into my head as far as like the probability of that, because when taxpayers see the bill double, they get a little nervous. So I would be concerned about that. It brings up lots of questions. So.
Yeah, I think that it's, I have to pull up the actual language. I see Franco has charter in his hand. It says something, I'd have to pull it up, but I know this issue has come up before, and the city attorney's office raised a red flag about just saying, hey, I'm not sure that you can levy more than the budgeted amount. I'd have to pull up the wording. There is a legal question. And then, as Trustee Hunziker mentions, there's financial question, which is that if we need $30, $40, $50 million, we're probably not going to hit the taxpayers up for that in 1 year. It would be a phase-in approach. I mean, this is how the general fund manages. The general fund does not issue tax anticipation notes. They sit on enough fund balance to, the city economist is in the room if he wants to correct me, but I believe that's what they do in the general fund. So, I mean, it is, but there is a legal question that and again, there's no financial advantage to doing so right now.
Okay. Thank you. Was that all of the public comment? Okay, is there any more questions or comments on resolutions 524? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion to resolution 524.
I'll move to adopt the resolution.
We have a motion to adopt resolution 524. Do I hear a second?
I'll second that.
And we have a second. Any more discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of adopting resolution 524, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Hearing none, motion carries. Sam's up next. Annual adjustment review. And what we're going to do here is we're going to have a presentation on the adjustment review. And then we're going to go into a executive session. I'll read how that's going to go in a little bit, and then we'll come back out. We're hoping the executive session doesn't last more than 15, 20 minutes, so people aren't waiting outside for a long time. So we're going to request that just the only things that happen in an executive question would be legal issues. Any other type of comments or questions we'll do outside of that. So, Sam?
Okay. I'll turn over to Stacy. Well, actually, I do want to go there, right, sorry. Basically, so as we go through this discussion today on the COLA presentation, I know Fpdr in the past, in last meeting, has given a recommendation, but I just do want to clarify everybody's role into this as we have a lot of discussion. So the board is the one who makes the decision on what the COLA will be with it. You'll be using information that you've already received that we give you today and that you get in the legal session, and that's part of my responsibility and my staff's responsibility is to make sure you have all the information you need and answer any questions you have about that information. And then once you make a decision, then it becomes my role or my staff's role to go ahead and implement that decision. So just want that clear as we do a whole lot of discussion. Seems a little obvious on the roles, but I just want to clarify the roles again with it. So you all are the decision makers, we are the information givers and clarifiers, and then we will implement whatever decision you make. And I'll turn it over to Stacy.
All right, so I'm back. As Sam has just mentioned, in March, the board deferred the decision on the July 1st COLA for FPDR2 beneficiaries so that we could bring back some additional information on a 2% option, which would be the maximum COLA that the charter allows. So the first 5 slides in this presentation kind of attempt to summarize that additional information about the 2% option and compare it to the blended, what we've been calling the FPDR COLA method, which is the blended PERS method that we've been using for the last 3 years. And then the 5 slides after that were prepared by Milliman, our independent actuaries, and they just give you a little more detail about some of the information that I've summarized on the slides, but it's straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak, from Milliman. So this first slide summarizes the impact been modified from the PERS methodology, and that's what we've done for the last 3 years. So in the right column, you'll see some information about the FPDR COLA method, and then you'll see next to it the 2% method. This is the exact same slide that you all saw in March with just information for the 2% COLA option dropped in. So the FPDR COLA information you have already seen. I think I can just summarize this slide by saying that when you look at just 1 year, there's really not much of a difference. And that is because 85% of our current FPDR2 beneficiaries are going to get 2% either way. And that's because all of their service was before October of 2013. And about 95% of them are going to get 1.9%, at least 1.9%. So for the vast majority of current retirees, the methods just aren't that different. Where they start to look different is when we get out into the future, which is on the next slide. But before I move on, are there questions about this slide, looking at the impacts for 1920? No? Okay. So the difference between the two approaches really emerges over time for both members and for the fund. And that is true, that's true of anything that is small and compounds, like a COLA. It is doubly true here because one of these COLA methods, the FPDR COLA method, is actually designed to decrease over time. So the differences are even more so going to emerge over time between these two methods. And as we've talked about, the charter is written to require these sequential, standalone, individual year decisions on the COLA, which is kind of a strange way to approach a COLA methodology, but it is how the charter is written. But I think in recognition of that strangeness, the board has really historically prioritized consistency in trying to use a consistent COLA approach while still exercising that responsibility to make a decision every year and give consideration to the options every year. And I do want to just pause and say, I know I've said this many times, but that consistency is a value in and of itself, both for members who are trying to plan retirements and trying to plan drawdowns of deferred compensation and IRAs. Consistency is valuable for them and their financial planners, and it's valuable for the fund in terms of managing the fund's finances. So given the board's past, intention to try to be as consistent as possible and the high value that the board's placed on that, this slide looks at the long-term impact of the FPDR COLA method and the 2% method as kind of two different paths, in addition to thinking of them as two different decisions for just this 1 year. So we're looking out mostly over 20 years, and the reason that we're doing that is because that's about as far as we can push Milliman when we start modeling the property tax levy piece. We got a lot of macroeconomic assumptions flowing into that model, and everyone gets uncomfortable going out further than 20 years. So that's why we're looking at it over 20 years. So let me go through a few of these. The first one is member pension maintenance after 30 years. So what this is trying to get at is how good of a job does each method do at keeping up with inflation over an average retirement? So if our current long-run inflation assumption is 2.75%, if you're
Can I
giving.
stop you for, where
Yes.
did that number come from?
So that number
2.75?
comes from Milliman, from their capital markets group. So we ask Milliman to do, every 2 years, they give us a long-run inflation assumption of
That-
two.
Like a federal labor number, or I couldn't find that number anywhere.
Yeah.
2.75, how it fit into anything, so I'm just curious.
So it looks like Trustee McLeod wants to say something.
So when you're preparing the actuarial valuation, you need to make a projection for the very long term about inflation as both the component of the discount rate that they use to value the liability, salary increases, and benefit values and things such as COLA. So it comes into play a variety of things, and so they're just making an assumption that the long-term cost of living increase is going to be 2.75% per year, which is separate from the plan's definition of COLA for benefit purposes.
And would that be a standard, where do they create that themselves, or do they use some formula, or how do they come up with those?
Every actuary will have their own methodology
Okay.
for choosing that, but there's information available. In fact, before this meeting, I went out just to take a look at what CPI urban rates have been. In fact, I just had an email open, and it looks like over the past 10 years, it looks like a year ago, the change in inflation, back in 2001, was as high as 2.7%. In more recent years, last year, it was kind of an anomaly, and it was higher at about 2.5%. Over the past 10 years, it's been about 1.5% per year. But historically, over 30, 40 years, it may be 2.5 to 2. So they're coming, this is a very, very long-term assumption. And so they're just setting that
And I think that you will find that, as Trustee McLeod is saying, there's a variety of methodologies and a variety of models out there and nobody knows what long-term inflation is going to look like. And there's a whole occupation of people who do this for a living and a whole bunch of different models. And 2.75% is very reasonable and fits into the long-term modeling that you're going to find out there. But we can grab up historic inflation. I think I might even have it on this, if I'm on my network drive here, although no, we never did get into the finance drive, did we? We can look at like 30-year historical projections. But even if
It is
you,
denoting 30 years, pension maintenance over 30 years, so I just wonder if it's just for my own.
Yeah.
I see numbers come up, and I'm curious. I know that, because that number obviously affects the rest of the table.
right, no, it absolutely does. And I think, until very recently, the city used 3% as a long-run assumption, so we have dropped it. Our Milliman, on the advice of Milliman, we have dropped what we were doing. Before that, it was 3. It hasn't been 3 lately, although it is this year. It just moves around
Okay.
a lot. The best I can do is say that 2.75% is what Milliman uses with their better expertise than we have in the valuation, and it's reasonable. So,
Okay, thank you.
But do take it as an assumption. And that's why I wanted to call it out on the slide. It is an assumption. The reason I looked over 30 years is because that's the average length of retirement of one of our members. So that's the average length of time between retiring and death. So that's why I grabbed 30 years. And it should be so what you can see with the 2% method is it's still not, it's not keeping somebody whole, because we have assumed that inflation will be more than 2% per year, but it is doing a better job of it than the Fpdr COLA method. Now, how good of a job the Fpdr COLA method is going to vary, because everybody who retired before 2013, it's going to be 80%. It's going to be the same as the 2% method. But for folks going forward, it's going to vary based on how much of their service is pre-2013 and how much after. So at the low point, it's going to be about 68% pension maintenance. And I have a slide right after this one that's going to give you like a little better view, I think, of pension maintenance. Looking at the plan liability, which Trustee McLeod can correct me, but I think a good layman's definition is that this is the cost of all of the benefits we owe our members right now in today's dollars. Is that a fair layman's description, Trustee McLeod, of the plan liability?
Yes, although it might understate it for active employees, but
For active
current active
employees.
employees, but certainly for retirees.
Thank you. And when Milliman prepared their latest calculation of the plan liability, which is based on June 30, 2018 data, and that they presented to the board in January, they calculated a liability of $3.32 billion. And we asked them to, and there's a million assumptions in that calculation. One of those assumptions is that going forward, the board will use the blended COLA, the Fpdr COLA method. So after our March board meeting, we asked them to rerun those numbers with a 2% COLA. So they went ahead and did that for us and came up with a $3.39 billion plan liability, which is about $65 million more. And we have a little bit more on that coming up later in the presentation. Everything else behaves kind of exactly as you would expect as we move down the chart. If we look all the way out to 2038, which is the 20th year of this analysis, the real market value property tax levy rate is slightly higher with the 2% method. The likelihood of exceeding our RMV rate cap, the $2.80, is just a tiny bit higher. If we look at the assessed value property tax rate, which is what taxpayers actually make property tax payments based on, we're kind of predicting that our high point for the property tax levy will be around 2035. So if we look at that high point for taxpayers, the rate is slightly higher. You can see that the levy at that high point is slightly higher. And then the cost to the median taxpayer, and I can talk a little bit more about this too on another slide, over the next 20 years is slightly higher with the 2%. Nothing surprising or shocking really emerges there, I don't think. Are there questions about this slide?
I have just one, and I think you mentioned at one point that the change in liability, that $65 million, is around 2% of the plan liability.
Yes, and for finance people are notoriously bad at doing math in their head. But
Yeah, I think at one point you had mentioned that, so 2%. I just wanted to verify, is, to the best of your knowledge, is this plan liability for the total plan, or is it just the Tier 2 people's liability?
so this is Tier 1 and Tier 2.
Okay, so so the impact seems like it's about 2% of the total plan liability, even though the change would only affect Tier 2.
It would only affect Tier 2,
Okay,
yes.
so the percentage change in Tier 2 liability would be higher.
Yes, and in fact, if you wanted me to get you that number, because we do have the liability by tier, and all of this would be attributable to the FPDR2 tier, so I could get you the percentage change. I can try to get you that during public testimony maybe. Let me see if I can look that up.
Thank you.
Any other questions about this slide?
If today's cost of living was 0.9, right?
Wait, did you say today?
Yeah, like say today's cost of the July,
It's
COLA.
3.9.
I know, but let's say it was.
Oh, let's say it was, okay.
0.9. Would your blended rate still be the same?
Yep,
It would still be the same.
Of course, the board, again, has the discretion to do as it wishes, but this method we've been using, it would be unaffected by actual inflation, yes.
In fact, Brian, I'm really glad you brought that up. That's part of why I wanted to look at the recent inflation rates. So they have been certainly up and down over the past 10 years, high of 3.5% or so one year, actually slightly negative in a couple of years, including 2008 to 9. But on average, over the past 10 years, about 1.5%. So even with the blended method right now, the actual plan COLA is higher than the average inflation over the past 10 years. And there's no guarantee it's going to stay at that rate for the next 10, 20 years. So, and again, the actuary's long-term assumption is 2.75%. So we would expect that it would gravitate up over time and there would be that shortfall. But just even with this 80% pension maintenance over 30 years, in theory, over the past 10 years, if actual inflation were 1.5 per year and the weighted COLA was closer to 1.9% or something, everyone really would have been gaining a little ground back, toward future years that were not as favorable.
If we reversed our thought, rather than trying to think forward and look at history, wouldn't an assuming annual inflation be 1.7 then?
Well, it depends on how far back you want to look, and this gets into...
10 years, let's say the 10 years. I mean,
So
would that be a
just-
way to look at it?
If you just want to look at 10 years and without having the data in front of me, my guess is yes, that inflation is lower than 2.75. So we entered this really historically unprecedented time of sustained low interest rates. So if we look at 10 years, boy, interest rates look low. They look lower than they've ever looked anywhere in, the United States history. And so now you're trying to guess, is that the new normal? Our interest are we so good at managing the macroeconomic economy that interest rates are going to stay at this level for forever? Or is this just an unusually long lull? And boy, do I not know the
And
answer
I'll
to
ask
that
them
question.
maybe more expertise. Does anyone in here with more expertise than I, if you went back 20 years, would we be the 2.75?
Let me ask a question here, because we're talking a lot about what this inflation rate is, and I'm not the economic person, but what it's designed to do is give you an idea of what inflation will have on your purchasing power, which is the first line. If you make the inflation rate higher, the number gets worse. If you make it lower, the number gets better. If I'm in the back of the room concerned about my living, I don't care, it's not 100%. So we can spend a lot of time on trying to hone in on what's the right amount, but what we're trying to say here is we're always going to see erosion in purchasing power for retirees.
Right,
The
but if you're
erosion
sitting-
is
if You're sitting
bigger.
in the back of the room worried about your income, right? And you see a 2% over a 1.8% when we're at a 3.8% growth, feel better. That's, I mean, I understand what you're saying. The inflation rate, we're thinking about several different numbers here. But the inflation rate, the reason I ask is, I mean, and I'm not going to discredit Millman. I think they're a great company or anything like that. But, I mean, I just want to throw everything out there, right? I mean, if we're looking at future, we might as well look at the past as well.
We can, but I want to be careful because we're getting, from my viewpoint, down into debating a figure, but we're trying to look at what the impact is
Right.
on the retarees.
Thank you.
And that impact can change with what your insurance, but what part of what the thing here is saying is that even, that we're going to see erosion in people's purchasing power because we have a cap at 2%. We're trying to, how much do you want to mitigate that erosion? And so if you go full 2%, that's the lowest erosion you can do. If you go with purse cola, for some people, it's a higher erosion of their purchasing power. We can debate whether this is 80%, 75%, 85%, but it still has the same impact. We're never going to be at 100, the chances of us getting to 100% here, so there's no erosion. So I just want to, we can spend a whole lot of time going over this figure. I don't think it changes the impact here of what we're doing. I'm just trying to keep us not having to spend an hour or two on just this one figure down here when you can see what the impact it has.
We are, I'll just throw this out. So we are blessed to have the city economist in the room, and he just ran the 20 years, that's 2.25%, 2.25% over the last 20 years. If that is helpful to the board, so it's lower than the 2.75 that we have assumed going forward. And definitely, like, just think in your minds, all right, 80% maintenance at 2.75% inflation. If inflation is less than that, it's going to be more. Maybe it's 90% or 92% or something. If inflation is higher than that over the long run, it's going to be less. It's going to be 75%. I mean, I think that Sam is right that the board, that if you're from a purchasing power maintenance point of view, the 2% method is going to do a better job of maintaining members' purchasing power. But I think Trustee McLeod is making an interesting point that over the last decade, the 2% COLA, potentially could have been fully maintaining purchasing power, maybe even a little to the good, if we just looked at a 10-year slice. So highly inflation assumption dependent when you're looking at this. But what is clear is that the 2% method does a better job of maintaining members' purchasing power than the other method. I mean, that much is clear. It's also clear, I mean, these are very obvious things, right? I mean, we all would have known that without doing any calculations. And obviously, it's more expensive. I mean, that's the flip side of that, and it increases the plan liability. Any other questions on that side? Okay. So continuing to talk about purchasing power, we made this chart that I hope helps folks visualize the purchasing power maintenance. I think everyone, knows what we're talking about, but for folks in the room, we like to talk about purchasing power maintenance because the real value of any amount of money is what you can buy with it, and what you can buy with a fixed amount of money declines over time because of inflation. So we can show an increase or decrease in purchasing power over time if we're talking about applying a change to amount of money, like a COLA to a pension benefit, and compare it to inflation. So again, this table, note at the bottom, assumes 2.75% inflation. And it runs out over 30 years, which is our average member's length of retirement. So if we start in the first year of retirement, at year 0, over the last 12 months, the median pension benefit of one of our retirees just retiring and starting out on their retirement was $6,762. And the green bars show inflation applied to that at the 2.75% rate over 30 years. So at the end of the 30 years, our member would need $15,259 out there in year 30, that's the green bar, to purchase the same amount of stuff if we had 2.75% inflation. So then we modeled some different COLAs, just so you could see the purchasing power maintenance over time. If we look at the orange line, which is the 2% COLA, you can see how good a job the 2% COLA does at keeping up with the 2.75% inflation. You see in the beginning, it really doesn't matter that much, because he's not keeping up with inflation, the difference widens over time, and out at the 30-year mark, with 2% COLAs every year, his pension benefit is $12,248 a month, which is 80% of the $15,259 he would have needed, again, given these inflation assumptions, to keep up the purchasing power. And then we did a similar analysis in the yellow line for a 1.75% COLA, with the red line for a 1.5% COLA, and with the blue line for a 1.42% COLA. Now, we can't really model the blended method, again, because everybody gets something different. Most folks right now would get the 2%. But we chose 1.75 and 1.5 because they're within the range of what folks with the blended COLA method would someday get. And they have been thrown out as potential COLA floors when the board has thought about you maybe having a COLA floor method. And then we threw in the 1.42% because that's the COLA that the last plan entrant on December 31st, 2006 would get. That's the lowest it could be, is the 1.42% COLA. So we're looking at 68% purchasing power maintenance with that low point COLA versus 80% maintenance with the 2%, again, assuming the 2.75 on the inflation. Does that graph make sense? Is it helpful, I hope?
Just to be clear though, the green is hypothetical, right?
Yeah.
And you're projecting all that.
Yes.
So if
It could be higher
If we
or
did 20,
lower.
we'd be at the 2.25 and all those green lines would be lower.
Yes, exactly. So for visualizing this, if we thought, all right, if it's been 2.25 over the last 20 years and we think it looks like that over the next 20, then the green lines are lower. If you think it's going to be 3%, the green lines are higher. Exactly. Next slide, we switch, again, we're back to a 20-year time horizon because we're talking about the tax levy and we don't want to go beyond the 20-year point with that. So what this slide shows is the increase in the levy, not the total amount of the levy, but the increase in the levy if the board adopted a 2% COLA method over the next 20 years rather than doing the blended COLA. So again, you'll see hardly any impact in these first couple of years, just a tiny little bit. By the time we're out in year 2038, 20 years from now, the levy's we're hitting the taxpayers up for an additional $4 million a year at that point. It does grow beyond that. If we were to go further out, it continues to grow in terms of the levy, but we only modeled the 20 years.
So Fpdr, if we use the COLA, where's that control? Is that just the bottom line? It would stay?
It's just, so what I'm showing here is the difference. So if you're in 2019, oops, sorry, I just hit the thing. In 2019, I mean, what is that, like $20,000 or $30,000 or something is the difference? And then when you're out in year 2031, it's about 1.5 million more, and when you're out in 2038, it's about 4 million more. So this is just a graph of the difference between what the levy would be with the blended method and what the levy would be with the 2% method.
And so I'm going to jump in and go back 2 slides.
Okay.
To where you say the levy at the high point over the next 20 years in 2035, the difference goes from 391 million to 394.6.
Yes.
So putting it in perspective, I mean, that looks like a gigantic increase, but it's
not
4
really.
million plus out of 394, so percentage-wise, but you can't put that big graph on this page without it fitting, so.
Right.
But it certainly gives a distorted image of the total impact.
And then you'll see on the next slide what I think is something that drives at what Trustee McLeod is talking about, which is like, well, this is looking at the difference. So this is trying to be able to show the board the kind of the exponential growth curve of the difference on this slide, so you can see not a big impact in the beginning. It's growing, it's growing, it's growing. I think that's what this slide captures. Slide 5, it makes you understand the exponential growth and that the growth is mostly out in the future. And as I said, it continues on that same cost curve beyond 2038. But this slide, I think, shows that the difference is not large when you go back to looking at the total levy, which is Trustee McLeod's point. So if we just look at, say, your average property taxpayer, so I just took somebody who owns a single family residence in the city of Portland right at the current median assessed value, which is $182,000 a year. So if you live in Portland, remember assessed value is completely divorced from real market value. Good luck finding anything for $182,000. But if we just look at that property taxpayer and then we model the impact on that homeowner over the entire 20 years, you'll see the orange line is what that property taxpayer is going to pay each year with the 2% COLA method and what they would pay with the Fpdr COLA blended method in the green line. And it's the same pattern that in the beginning, there's so little difference that you can't even tell the two lines apart, but there is a bigger gap in the out years. But even in 2038, the 2% option is costing this taxpayer about $7 more per year on their total property tax bill. Now, the difference, the gap between those two lines does continue to widen beyond 2038, again, because of compounding, but also because of the difference in the COLA methods themselves and the inherent difference. But you can see.
Until the last FPNR2 member is collecting, or not collecting.
Yep, until we hit that tipping point where people are, yes, until mortality gets to the point where it's really eroding that, yes. Before we take a quick look at Milliman slides, are there questions about these slides and what any of this data means?
No, I appreciate you going to 20 years. I mean, we're still focused. I think one of the reasons you mentioned at the beginning is the city doing an annual review of this is for this exact reason, right? So we're looking a sliver of the graphs that you're looking at. We're not looking at the whole graph. We're looking, for today, we're looking at a sliver of the graph. The assumptions that you're making are great. I understand them, but I'm just saying the true test that we're trying to do here is a very sliver of the full graph.
So so the impact for just, if you just want to think of this as the 1-year decision, which, I kind of laid out the reasons that you might not want to think of it as a 1-year decision, but if you did, then this is the slide for you, slide 2, which shows we're not talking about big differences here, again, because almost everybody's going to get that 2% anyway. The differences emerge over time, and that's if the board is choosing a new path, then the differences emerge over time.
But we're not choosing a new path today. We're just making a decision based on this year.
It depends. Yeah, it depends on how you want to.
That's the way I read it.
How you want to view it.
Okay.
I just wanted for you guys to see directly the slides that Milliman had prepared in response to our request, and those are these next slide. So you all remember back in January, every 2 years Milliman comes and they have calculated the plan liability and calculated the impact on the tax levy. And as I said before, there are a lot of assumptions built into that, including that the method the board has used for the last 3 years, that the blended method would continue. So just to get you the most up-to-date information that you could possibly have, we asked them to just rerun all that stuff with a 2%, which turned out not to be, very complicated. So they were, we could do that in a fairly cost-effective and time-effective way. So you will see them referring to old PERS throughout here. Remember, that's what we used to call the old PERS method. It is not historically equivalent to 2%, but for purposes of this forward-looking analysis, it's the same as 2% because Milliman always assumes that inflation is above 2%. So we don't get into that banking thing. It's the same as 2% for this forward-looking analysis. On slide 2, you'll see, we've already talked about this, but the effect on the plan liability, that under the modified PERS method, which is what they call our blended rate, they had calculated a $3.32 billion liability, and that goes up to a $3.39 billion liability with the 2% COLA method. And then there's the increase in the normal cost as well that you can see there. Here is their modeling on the levy. You can see the increase that we've already talked about, the increase in the levy out in 2038. At the median probability levy amount is about $4 million. And you can see that very slight increase in the RMV levy rate and the likelihood of exceeding the 280 cap. And then this last slide just is their recalculation of the total property tax levy for the 2% method. And they always show their levy amounts as a probability distribution. That little diamond shape is the median probability, the 50th percentile probability of the total levy amount going out 20 years. And I did throw on the slide from last January's presentation. This slide was prepared with the blended COLA. So it's called 25 because it was slide 25 in their January presentation. You want to compare that to slide 4, which is their modeling with the 2% COLA. So I've kind of summarized all this information on the earlier slides, but for those of you who might want to see the slides directly from Milliman, this is what they prepared for the board on this question.
Can you go back a couple slides where they reference a 3.87% discount rate? Where is that?
Oh, yes. So that, I mean, in terms of comparing methods, that has no impact because it's applied the same way to both methods. But the 3.87%, we're required under governmental accounting standards to use a risk-free rate as the discount rate. So this is just a way of trying to capture the time value of money. We always use the June 30 value of the GeoBond index, and it happened to be 3.87% last June 30th. But it shouldn't cause any difference because it was applied in the same way to both methods, the 3.87%. It's just how they turn future costs into today's dollars.
So the higher the discount rate, the less unfunded liability you would have?
Yes, the higher the discount rate, the lower the liability, yeah.
Okay. And this is what we used this year, was the 3.87?
It was 3.87, yeah. And if you guys will remember, it's considerably higher than it was a couple of years ago, because a couple of years ago, Brexit happened right before June 30th, and we had like a global market bond collapse. And I mean, it's just the value on any given June 30, so. But it has a big impact on the liability. It moves it up and down quite dramatically. But they use the same for each method. So for purposes of comparing the two, it doesn't matter.
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Did we have any questions for Stacy? I think we're going to be going into executive session, and then if we had any more questions, we can ask afterwards. So if nobody has any more, did we have any sign up? Should we do that now or?
After, I think,
After the executive session?
that's usually just before you vote, is when you, the public,
I
you
want to
can
thank you
discuss
for
some more
taking the
after.
time to put it
Yes.
together. There's a lot of.
Great
that's
presentation.
helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to read this here
Oh,
about our executive session.
I'm so sorry.
Go
I
ahead.
do have one question,
Oh, sure.
Stacy. And that is, for current, one of the things we have to consider is whether this is, I mean, obviously, it's a one-year decision, but as you say, it's kind of a methodology. Are we suggesting a methodology change? Would it be awkward to go back next year and justify going back to this modified PERS method if we went to 2% this year, for example, or put in a floor? So I think that is something very important to be considered. But I'm curious, with the individual, I have to admit, I don't really remember all the impact of the individual calculations and sequential years. Suppose that we decided to leave it as modified PERS today, and a year from now went to 2%. Just what would be the impact on an individual today who had some prorated? Would they always be somewhat less than somebody who had 2% all along because they're building from the COLA, from the benefit they had the year before?
Yes.
Did I ask that correctly?
Yes, because in the sense that if you don't get a salary increase one year, but then you go back to getting the same salary increase as everybody around you, you will always be behind.
It's because it's applied to the
Everybody-
then immediately prior benefit.
Because it compounds. But I know there was some confusion about this at the last board meeting, that the COLA decision that you make, everybody who's a current retiree gets that COLA. So if you said we're gonna stick with modified this year, but we want to go to 2% next year, then every single beneficiary of the plan next July 1 is going to get 2%, regardless of when they retired, regardless of how their service was split out, or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make
Yes,
sense?
it does.
Okay.
And likewise, if we were to make a change to 2% and then go back to modified in the future, this a similar thing would happen. It's just whatever level of benefit they're at the present, the then applicable
COLA
COLA
gets
method
applied.
would be applied to them. Okay.
That's exactly right. Yes.
you very
So
much.
it would be the reverse of that if you went the other way. Yes.
All right, if there's no more questions, the board will now meet in executive session for the purpose of consulting with the board's attorney. The executive session is held pursuant to ORS 192.6602H, which allows the board to meet in executive session to consult with counsel. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during the executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. At the end of the executive session, we will return to open session and welcome the audience back into the room. normal session, general session. Was there a sign up? Attorney Hank Kaplan. Welcome, Hank.
Good afternoon, Trustee Lehman, members of the board. My name is Hank Kaplan. I'm here on behalf of Portland Firefighters Association, Local 43. I really don't have much to add to the discussion, but I do have one question. Obviously, this is a policy issue, not a legal one. And really, it's a question of whether or not and to what extent the board is determined to maintain purchasing power for FPDR 2 members. Notably, this doesn't apply to FPDR 1 members because their salary is attached to the wage rates for firefighters, top step firefighters, and police officers. The question I have, I'm kind of curious. I'm not sure if anybody can answer this question just off the top of your heads, but the modified PERS method that's being discussed in the past three or four years that this issue has come up, there's never been a question of, or an answer to the question of what happens if the rate of inflation is below the 1.25%. The 1.25% under the PERS system is a maximum, but not a minimum. And if the rate of inflation falls below 1.25% in the PERS system, then after they have the banking methodology, and after you catch up with the lost inflation, then further increases can, at least theoretically, go below the 1.25%. And a comment that Stacy made, she said something like, if there's a period of low inflation, that it might actually be to the benefits of members. And I guess my question is really a hypothetical one. Doesn't matter this year. But if we're talking about what's the modified PERS method that this board has adopted, and if it were going to be consistent in that modified method, does that also mean that if the inflation rate drops below 1.25%, that there's no catching up, so to speak, in future years? So that's just, I'm not sure if I articulated that well, but basically, under PERS, if the rate remains flat for a long period of time, then after you've caught up with your lost purchasing power through their bank system, which FPDR used to have a banking system as well to keep track of lost purchasing power, then the rate can drop below that 1.25%. And so I just, I asked the question because it is a heads I win, tails you lose. There's no possible scenario under which you can actually catch up with lost purchasing power, regardless of what the inflation rates do. Just a question.
Stacy, could you answer that or get a clarification?
Hi, Hank. Hi. So just to try to answer it, so my understanding of the PERS method is, take it for what it is, I don't work for PERS, is that 1.25% is 1.25% irrespective of inflation. So what they do is they take the percent of your service that happened before, say it's 50%, I was kind of trying to go through this with Trustee Lyman before, and apply that to the old PERS method, which could be less than 2%, to your point, for a newly retired person, because they are still employing the COLA banking on that old method, and as have we been for the last 3 years, applying the COLA banking, but only to the application to the service before 2013. But the 1.25%, which is to the percent of service after 2013, just is 1.25%, irrespective of inflation. And so I'm not 100% sure that I'm understanding.
Well, that answers my question,
Does that answer it?
Yes,
And
thank you.
that's how I have construed the board's direction for the last 3 years, and that is my understanding of what PERS does. But I don't work for PERS, and we haven't encountered that at PERS yet. So
the way we would do it, it would be 1.25 no matter what if we use the modified person.
Right.
If inflation or COLA was
And-
0% that year, we would still get 1.25 if we went with the modified PERS.
That's unless the board told me that my understanding was wrong. Yes, that has been my understanding. And that's why we've modeled that 1.42% as the lowest that somebody could get, because they would have the maximum amount of service post-2013, and that would get them as close. Nobody in our system should get down to 1.25%. Could happen with strange time loss situations, but under normal circumstances.
Okay, well, I appreciate that clarification, and obviously, that's a very unlikely scenario, that inflation would consistently fall below that 1.25% threshold, and so there's likely going to be some erosion of purchasing power no matter what the board does today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Did we have any other? Do we have any more discussion or comments, or? Hearing none, I'd entertain it. Oh, go
I
ahead.
have a question. It's for Stacy. So I wrote down, what I really want to understand is the risks of moving away from our prior methods that we've used. And I thank you to our counsel. I understand from a legal perspective, but I'm still, I wrote down also a risk that you mentioned to the fund, of managing the fund long-term. Can you explain that to me?
No, I wouldn't characterize it as a risk. Well, it's an interesting question. I would characterize it as something you need to consider as part of your fiduciary responsibilities. So it's going to cost, Milliman's estimate, about $65 million over the life of the plan if the board adopted a 2% COLA path. So if it's a one-year decision, the cost is, I believe, a couple $100,000. I'd have to go back and look. But I wouldn't characterize it as a risk to the fund. No. I mean, the fund will, there's no greater risk of fund insolvency. You saw the very tiny increase in the likelihood that we would need to exceed our 280 cap. It went from 1.0% to 1.1%. But yeah, no, I wouldn't characterize it as a risk to the solvency of the fund or anything like that.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Any more general questions? Hearing none, I'd entertain a motion on the benefit adjustment for the July 1st of 2019.
Okay. I'd make a motion that the board has understood its discretionary abilities on a year-to-year basis and on a non-precedent setting type of future outlook on the fund. And given the unusual circumstances of the current economy, the current growth, I would make a motion that we step away for a minimum of this current year from the modified PERS to a just flat 2% pay raise to be effective July 1 or the next fiscal year. Again, using the board's discretion of having a year-to-year analysis of the growth of the fund, the growth of the economy, and for the benefit of the members in this current unusual economy. So I would make a motion of a 2% raise effective July 1.
We have a motion for a 2% COLA increase July 1st. Do we have a second?
Yeah, I'll second that, understanding that our formula, our modified PERS formula has worked well for us in the past, and that this is an exercise of discretion just for 1 year. I second the motion for a 2% increase.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion, comments on this?
No more discussion, but I concur with Liz's comments, Ms. Fouts' comments that, and Trustee Hunziker's, that this is in reflection of the unusually high inflation relative to recent prior years, that we want to just make this move without really throwing the modified PERS methodology out in perpetuity. We just want to consider this change for this year.
Thank you. And I agree, this is our duty to address this every year, and I believe that due to the inflation this year, that the 2% would be appropriate. So So if there's no more comments, I call for the vote, and let's do a roll call vote on this, please. So all those in favor, well, actually, go ahead.
Trustee Fouts?
Aye.
Trustee Hunsaker?
Aye.
Trustee Lehman?
Aye.
Trustee McLeod?
Aye.
Appears that the motion passed. So, and then could we take a look at that, how it's written too? Because we wanted to make sure that it was, everybody made the statement, but we wanted in the motion that this is a
We'll make
one-time.
it verbatim, starting with the motion through, so everybody's knows
Okay.
a verbatim part of the minutes.
Very good.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you for everybody's hard work
don't
and
run.
attention to that issue.
Can I bring something up unrelated? I'm still on the
Absolutely.
COLA, but not on that particular motion. I do think that next time we review this subject, I would like to circle back to a discussion on a minimum aggregate COLA for any particular participant, but not at this time. I don't think it's necessary, it's not going to be anywhere close, and I'd just like to revisit it perhaps, next spring.
Yeah,
I
so-
second that. I would love to go
Yeah.
have a work session on that.
Yeah, so could we not only put it in the notes, but actually follow up on it and decide maybe next winter or spring, have a work session and discuss this with all the players and see if we want to move forward or not with possibly a charter change or what we could do within our rules?
Well, normally we start the discussion in March for that, and we can start a discussion in March for what you would like it to look for, a floor as you've discussed, and we can make that part of a board meeting, or you can have part of a board meeting converted to a work session. So I think March would be the appropriate time because you do your budget in January. March is your next meeting, and we'll get more with whomever is the chair at that time and work out a process to go through it. So I'll give you March.
Okay, and it may be possible from my perspective, I don't know that I was pursuing it from a charter change point of view as so much as working into the subsequent year's motion to have, as part of the discretion of the board at that time, to indicate whether or not we'd like to have a minimum COLA applicable to any affected participant that would not be less than, say, 1.5%, as opposed to just letting the formula work any way that it might.
So would it be accurate to say that the board would want to look at next year? I assume you would want to look at the 2% option again. You would want to look at the blended COLA method that we've used in the 3 years before that, and you'd want to look at the blended COLA method with a floor. Would that be a good summary of what the board would want to see?
Yes.
And does that timing that Sam laid out work? We have historically had that conversation in March, and that way we've been able to extend it to May if we needed to. Does that timing still work?
Sure, yeah.
Or were you envisioning something different, Trustee Lyman?
Well, I think it's even a bigger discussion, because, I don't know, I guess it's working out and we're making a decision. I think it's appropriate and we can continue to do this. So I think that's, next year in March would be great.
Okay.
And just a reminder, we have the off months, that's at your discretion, so if we need to take an April meeting, you can, so you go March, April, and May, so that's always an option you have there.
And I apologize, Trustee McLeod, that I could not calculate the percent of the liability increase without a laptop that I couldn't get to, but I will send that too.
That's okay. I was estimating that it might be in the vicinity of 5%. I just looked at the normal cost change, and since only Fpdr 2 has the normal cost right
Right.
now, it was
Right.
about 5%.
It was
So,
about 5%,
yeah.
so you already did the math in your head. All right.
Just guessing.
But better than me.
Probably not.
Okay, and then we're just into information items now. So Sam, what do we got, or Stacy?
The first one's Stacy on the finances.
Okay, sorry, I'm trying to find my first information item. The expenditure report, yes. But before I talk about the expenditure report, I did want to update the board on the budget, as I do kind of every year at this time. You guys approved our budget back in January, but then there are, minor changes as the mayor's proposed budget decisions and the decisions of other bureaus kind of ripple through our budget. So council did approve the city budget last Thursday, sitting as the city budget committee. They still have to adopt it as city council in June, but there aren't usually significant changes at that point. So there are a variety of very tiny changes to our budget, mostly for the internal service funds that we buy services from, very minor things. But we did make one change that I wanted to let the board know about. We shifted $500,000 out of our interagency agreement budget with the Police Bureau for PERS contributions, because, as I'm sure Trustee Hunziker knows, continue to have very high and growing police officer vacancy rates, and they have not been able to hire as many folks as they projected in the current year. And in fact, City Council sort of pre-captured some of those vacancy savings from the police budget for next year. So in order to make all that work in terms of balancing the budget across the whole city, we dropped that budget by $500,000 and shifted that money into the pension budget, which was nice because we've had not as much mortality as we would have predicted in our pension, in our retiree population this year. So we shifted that $500,000 to the pension budget. If we needed it, we have $11 million, I think, in contingency, and we could shift it back to the PERS contribution budget. So it's just it's a thing that we have to do to make budgets work across the whole city and the way our budget intersects with the Police Bureau budget. Are there any questions about that or about the budget? Okay. On the expenditure report, not too much exciting to point out this. I always struggle to come up with something exciting to tell you guys about here. If you look at pension contributions, they look kind of funny. We've only spent about half of our budget, but that is just a timing issue. Again, those third quarter billings, neither police nor fire got their third quarter billings to us in time for us to pay them before April closed. So that's why that looks a bit odd. Talking about property taxes, if you look at the table and you look at the second line for taxes, you'll see our budget's $151.5 million essentially. And if you go over to the year-to-date total, you'll see we've got $151.4 million already, and we'll get another $4 or $5 million before the year ends, maybe more than that. So you can see that, that's where some of our higher fund balance is. I can't remember ever hitting our budget for property taxes this early in the year, and that's mostly because of that Comcast payment. And that is really all I can think of to point out to you guys. Does anybody have any questions about the expenditure report?
I am on the disability side. Is that because of a billing type thing too, or are disability benefits dropping?
I would have to, disability benefits are really volatile. And yes, they are running low, and they ran low last year. But there shouldn't be a timing difference with disability benefits. Like there's a few exceptions, like light duty, where we subsidize folks who go back to modified duty. There are some billing issues there, but those are minor. So my guess, and I'd have to go back and look at our projected spending, is that disability benefits will come in under budget, would be my guess.
Good.
Because we're far enough along in the year, yeah. And that was the case last year as well. And it's a really small part of the overall budget.
I'll run through all the other informational items here fairly quickly. So the second one is update the board handbook. I'm going to delay that to our next board meeting, and this is going to be more clarification on what constitutes a board meeting and what constitutes a quorum. So we'll clarify that there, and that'll give me some time to publish the book and get it out to you. You can review it, and then we'll talk about it in the meeting. The next one is legislative updates. I've given you updates all along on the PTSD presumption. That's passed the Senate. It's sitting in the House. They have 4 weeks left in the session to get it through. I think there's a high probability that it will pass through unless there's a backup of bills and this gets caught up in that. Last time I'd given you an overview on the legislative agenda. I talked to you about the taxes, and at that time the business tax had not passed. And I said if the business tax passes, you're probably going to see a PERS bill come along with it. So the business tax passed, and there is now a PERS bill making some changes to PERS. I'm not going to go much into it. You can read the Oregonian and stuff on it because I'm going to wait for it to work its way through the process. It's Senate Bill 1049. It's designed to lower employer contributions, and it does have an impact on some of the PERS benefits for some people. I don't want to go through that yet until the bill passes because it now has to go through the House. So until it runs through. So again, I will talk about both Senate Bill 507, the PTSD presumption, and 1049, the PERS changes, the next meeting we have when the bills are finalized. We'll talk about how it'll impact FPDR members and the fund.
Okay.
With that, FPDR updates. The only update I have there is the mayor's office is looking for a new designee for the mayor. Once that designee is identified, it will then, that person will have to go through city council to be approved. It's all per the charter. I'll let you know as soon as the person's been nominated and is ready to go in front of council. I'll send you an email who that is with that. With that, future board meeting agenda, we have, as we've talked about, there is no agenda items for July. September, we have the state of FPDR as typical. We'll discuss the 2 legislative bills. We'll also talk about the board handbook section. And then if that is our next meeting, we'll have Mr. Jimkowski given 15 minutes to talk on that. So I don't know what we'll do. What we've done the past couple of years, we'll wait until toward the end of June to make the final decision, just in case something comes up. And if you have anything, let me know. If not, by the end of June, I'll let you know and say we're going to cancel it, because we need to cancel it about 3 weeks in advance.
Sam?
Yes.
I know I think at our last meeting, you guys brought up a possibility of training or continuing ed
Yes.
for board members. Is that still being planned?
Yeah, so we're working on that here right now. I've got some of the people here that are putting together some of the classes
Okay.
for that. We just had to get help through with some of the budget stuff and a few other things, but we will have some of the classes, and we're hoping to get them, in the next few months. It would be a good opportunity to have them with the new chairperson also to go through them. So yes, we're working on those right now.
That'll be great.
In your future meetings, the state of FPDNR, I believe that's where you give us the informational statistics of claims brought to FPDNR, claims approved and claims denied, and things to that effect. I did a little history checking on FPDNR, and I believe when it went to the current system, there was a board agreement with FPDNR that a lot of those claims would be evaluated by FPDNR and that timeliness would not be an issue. When you come to us with that future thing, I want to make sure that that's still accurate and that claims aren't being denied solely on timeliness issues, because if I read the minutes and understand the history of the board, that shouldn't have been an issue. So when you come to the meeting.
We'll talk about that with
Yeah.
it. Again, if anybody on the state of FPDR, you've seen what was last year, and you can go back through on the website and take a look. If there's specific information, more detail you want that we didn't cover last year, we have a few notes of some of your questions. We'll incorporate that into it, and so we'll incorporate some numbers.
And Trustee Fouts pointed out maybe a clerical error there on the video screen. The year, is that something that can be changed if you look at the year?
What?
Mine says 18.
It says 18.
Yeah. It wasn't me. I'm not that observant, even though I should be. It was Trustee Fouts. So.
Okay. All right, anything else?
No. No, I think that's it.
Okay,
Anybody
thank
have
you.
anything else? Any good of the order, comments? All right, well, I will adjourn the meeting. Thank you. I wanted to do that.